Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this information session about Heritage Area project grants. We are going to be talking about everything that you need to know to apply for Heritage Area project grants. I'm Emily Hubner. I'm our Director of Operations and Programs. And we also have Director Liz Chateau on the call. Washington County Assistant and Newcomer House Manager Rachel Nichols is here for a while. Hi, Rachel. And we also have Heritage Area Assistant Olivia Peterson today too. So it's just about 10:30 now, so we're going to go ahead and get into it. We're going to be recording this session, as I mentioned, and we'll be sharing it to our YouTube page, and we'll be sending it out in follow-up as well as a lot of links and other resources. So thank you for joining us. Okay. So today we're going to talk about an introduction to the Heritage Area Program and grant logistics. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with MHAA, which is the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority, and HCWHA, which is us, the Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area. But we are going to talk about how they are different because it can sometimes be confusing to potential applicants, these two organizations that work in tandem on this project grant round. And then what are MHAA project grants and what do they fund? And we'll talk about important deadlines, which are coming up quickly. And then information for applicants who are located here in the heart of the Civil War Heritage Area. And we're going to go through each individual bit of the application. And then we're going to get into some tips and next steps, I've included some observations from last year's grant round. I looked through some of our notes to see what our reviewers commented on and what performed well. And so we're going to talk a little bit about just some special tips about project grants and what to look out for. We'll also be linking resources, which will be especially helpful in follow-up for you, and then practical next steps. All right, so we'll talk about the Heritage Area Program first. The Heritage Area Program is the program through which this project grant round is run, and there are many different components to that. And so locally, we have the Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area team. We are the Heritage Area for Carroll, Frederick, and Washington counties. Executive Director Liz Chateau, who is on the call, Rachel Nichols, the Washington County Assistant and Newcomer House Manager, Olivia Peterson, our Heritage Area Assistant, and I'm Emily Hubner, our Director of Operations and Programs. And so our team for the project grants, especially, keep in mind, Liz is our contact for Frederick County grants. Rachel is our contact for Washington County grants, and I assist Carroll County applicants. You can reach out to any one of us, but the three of us have our three assignments. And so because we find it's helpful to work in an extended way with applicants. So the Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area, we have our mission and vision here, and projects that are funded through the Heritage Area Program need to contribute to this mission. So the Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area, with our partners, preserves and promotes the historic sites, towns, cultural landscapes, and diverse stories in Carroll, Frederick, and Washington counties, Maryland. That's a pretty big mandate, and so we think that there's a lot of a lot of different projects can fit within that mission. And this mission is fairly new from the past couple of years. And so if you've applied in the past, or if you were familiar with our organization many years ago, this is an update. And then our vision is a vast and diverse audience engages meaningfully with the past and present in the Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area, carrying their experiences here into the future. And so looking for relevance, looking for the ability to reach people, that is our vision. So going back even a couple steps, what are heritage areas? If you are not familiar with the Heritage Area Program, heritage areas support the economic well-being of Maryland's communities by preserving and celebrating the state's history, cultural traditions, and natural resources through partnerships like these project grants that promote, support, and create place-based experiences for visitors and residents alike. And so that visitors and residents alike part, these place-based experiences often speak to heritage tourism. And so here we have a map of all 13 of the heritage areas across the state of Maryland. We are one of several, and these project grants are competing with projects from across the state. And here, the Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area, we're a fairly large heritage area covering parts of Carroll, Frederick, and Washington counties. You can see that in Carroll County, it's a lot of corridors, it's a lot of troop movements that were included versus big chunks in Frederick and Washington counties. These boundaries can be updated, but it takes time, and there's an application process for that. And so when you're considering a project, it's always good to double check that it's actually located within the boundaries of the heritage area. Although many of you today are previous applicants, and so you already know. So the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority is separate from the Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area. This is the state level management entity for the Heritage Area Program. They are part of Maryland state government. Currently, they receive up to $6 million annually, which is allocated from something called Program Open Space. Their offices are based in Crownsville, and they are located in the offices of, like they use the printers of, and the office space of the Maryland Historical Trust, but they are distinct from that. It's a separate entity. And they are the ones who administer the project grant application and the awards. And so when you get online and you get into the portal and the project grant guidelines and things like that, those are created by the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority. And they are staffed by Ariane Hofstedt, Andrew Arvizu, and Martha Waldron. And they've also done their own trainings as well. This is just specific for Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area applicants. And so again, just the difference between these two things, the Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area, we are a private nonprofit organization. We serve Carroll, Frederick, and Washington counties. We are your local heritage area. And we have a committee that reviews these project grant applications, and then we send our local grant rankings up to state reviewers, just as every other of the 13 heritage areas does. And so contact us, me or Liz or Olivia or Rachel, about coming up with a project, about application content review. There is a draft review deadline, which is going to be on Valentine's Day. We'll go over that with important dates. And if you need to get in touch with somebody at MHAA, you can get in touch with one of us if you're already in communication with and comfortable with us. We can get you in touch with the right person at the state level. And then the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority, just in review, that is an independent state government entity. They are located in Crownsville, and they work with all 13 heritage areas across the state, including us. And so they're going to receive our local rankings, and then they have a state committee consisting of reviewers from across the state, and they submit their final rankings, and that determines the final awards. And so you can contact MHAA if you have a specific question about the application portal. They're the ones administering that application process. If you have technical questions about the application itself. Also, if you're previously awarded project grants and you're working on those reports, or if you have questions about that, you can get in touch with them. And MHAA staff, again, is Ariane Hofstedt, Andrew Arvizu, and Martha Waldron. They're a great team. And MHAA has done their own information session, and you are strongly encouraged to check it out, view the information session that they hosted. Their recording is on the MD Heritage Areas Program YouTube page, and I am including a link to that in this presentation, which we'll send in follow-up. They're going to review a lot of the same information that we're presenting here, but they're going to go deeper into certain aspects, and they're going to have less to say about specific local concerns like we do. All right, so I think I'm going to turn to Olivia Peterson to present the next couple slides. Olivia, if you'd like to go ahead, and I'm going to mute myself.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit more information about the project grants. So the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority grant program is a source of funding designed to assist and encourage the preservation of historical, archaeological, natural, and cultural resources and support economic development through heritage tourism within heritage areas certified by MHAA. So there are two types of project grants. The first is the capital grants, which can be awarded up to $100,000. These are for bricks and mortar type projects that involve acquisition, development, rehabilitation, restoration, and/or pre-development. These projects may require an easement through the Maryland Historical Trust, which are subject to Section 106 review, and these projects do not necessarily have to be involving a historical property. The second type are non-capital grants, which can be awarded up to $50,000. These are projects involving planning, design, interpretation, events, and/or technology, and examples include exhibits and wayside panels. Something to consider, these project grant requirements, the first being projects must be located within the boundaries of a certified Maryland heritage area in order to be eligible. The second, grant funding generally cannot go towards staff salaries or project marketing. So a certain percentage can go towards overhead fees. And the third, these project grants require a dollar for dollar match using any combination of cash and in-kind or donated value. State money cannot be used as a match.
Great. I'll also add that if you're curious about the overhead fees and being able to claim some of those, you can talk about that with your local grant contact and look specifically into the guidelines, because the percentage that will be allowed towards overhead fees is kind of developing at the moment. I think currently it's at 10%, but there's some legislation that might change that. And so we'd be happy to talk about it if that's something you're interested in being able to claim.
Okay, and then as Emily mentioned, here are some important dates to remember. So January 27th, the ITA, or the intent to apply deadline, which is actually next Monday, so it's coming up pretty quick. February 14th is going to be the deadline to submit your draft to a local grant contact for feedback. Just as a reminder, like Emily said, Emily is the contact for Carroll County, Liz is the contact for Frederick County, and then Rachel is the contact for Washington County. March 3rd is the application deadline, and then by July 10th, the results will be announced where work can begin if you are awarded.
Great, thank you. And I'll add that January 27th intent to apply deadline. I know it's right around the corner. However, nothing you put in your ITA is permanent. If you ultimately decide you want to totally change your project, you can do that. But the ITA is just something you have to get in so that you can access the full grant application. Later, if you get an ITA and you later decide that actually you're not ready to execute this project and or you don't have the time to get in the application, you won't be penalized in the future for submitting an ITA. This is just for us to be able to gauge the level of need within the heritage area and across the state. And it helps us ensure that this program receives the full funding that it can receive, because it's an up to thing. And so we definitely encourage you to get in an ITA, even if you're not 100% on the application itself. And speaking of the application, let's get into this application. In past years, they have streamlined it, but it is still a multi-part application that is going to take some time. And so thank you for joining us to talk about the various parts of it. There's going to be an overview, which is informational about your organization. There's going to be project information, which will help our reviewers understand exactly what you are proposing to do. Budget information, which in some ways is an even faster way for our reviewers to understand exactly what you're proposing to do. The project impact, which is going to speak to how you help contribute to heritage tourism, how you help accomplish the goals and mission of the Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area and the Maryland Heritage Areas program. We'll get into the specific questions for project impact. Capital grants will have to submit some property information, and then supplemental documents, which these are going to be things like resumes, like photographs of facades that you're trying to improve, other things like that. Supplemental documents are important to include because they provide important backup and support for your application, for us to understand how you came to your numbers and your timeline. So the overview is a really simple section once you get into the application, but I want you to keep in mind when you're approaching the overview that the person you designate as primary project contact, they are going to be the person receiving all communications related to the grant. And so make sure it's the right person. Sometimes folks will put in, like a department head or a mayor or somebody who's not going to be involved in the day-to-day of writing that application and accessing the application in the portal, but the person should be the actual project manager who's writing the application. Also part of this is acknowledging that you have read the FY26, that's the current round, MHAA project grants guidelines for applicants, and that you acknowledge you can provide the administrative and managerial oversight needed to complete the proposed project. And so it definitely is important to look at those grant guidelines. It will answer questions that you have as you're approaching the application. The project information. Now we're getting into a scored section of the application. They're going to ask you for a title. It should be specific to your property or your project, and try to make it not too long. We should be able to look at the title and know what you're trying to do. And then we have the project summary. This should be brief. The project summary is just the facts for this phase of work, the specific deliverables that you are going to complete using these grant funds and the match. They limit it to a 250 word count, so you'll want to keep it brief. It's quickly how you explain what your grant application is for. And then the overall project description, which is up next, is where you can describe the larger context of this application. You can describe any past or future phases of work that you have planned. You can get into specific contractors or consultants that you are planning to work with. That's where you provide a little more information about this application. But when you're writing in that project description, you definitely still want to be clear about what the current request is for. And so project description is larger context. I've included an example here. This is the example that they include in the FY26 guidelines. So here they're applying for phase 2 construction funds that will include installing a new roof and adding a bathroom to the visitor center. Final construction drawings were completed last year in phase 1, a previous phase, and a final phase 3 landscaping project is scheduled for next year, which will complete the project. But it doesn't leave you with any questions about what this phase is for and exactly what they're trying to complete. And including the phase 1 and the phase 3 helps fill in any questions about what work has been done. Are they prepared for the new roof and adding the bathroom? They've already got drawings and they have a plan for the future for their next steps. And so the question that reviewers are going to be asked is, does the summary, timeline, and overall project description provide a feasible plan for the creation of a heritage tourism product? This is where you show, yes, we have planned for this project. And so part of that, it mentioned timeline. So you're going to get into the timeline, and this timeline is going to impact the perception of your organization's readiness to complete this project. And so it's important to note that these grants, the results are going to be released by July 10th of 2025. And so anything that you're applying for this grant, it has to start July 10th at the earliest. It can start after that too, but don't put in March or April or May. Within the timeline, nothing should be happening previous to that for this grant application. If you want to mention a previous phase, you can do that. You can say in January, we're doing this groundwork or something like that, and include previous phase, and then include current phase starting July 10th. We always advise this. It's important to create the timeline in collaboration with all of your involved team members. That helps ensure that it's a realistic timeline and no one's going to be surprised if you do receive the funding. That includes consulting with vendors on turnaround times. Our reviewers, many of them are, they're professionals working in planning, working in history, working in preservation, working in the arts. If they see something that seems surprisingly fast or surprisingly slow, it'll catch their notice. And so definitely make sure that you've consulted with vendors. Writing a detailed timeline, as we've said, demonstrates you've considered all steps necessary. And so a one-part timeline is not going to succeed. If you say, we're just do project, we need to see that exactly your plan of action. And keep in mind, if your project is funded and it's not running according to the timeline, we understand that things happen, particularly with these kinds of projects. And so you will be permitted to request an extension or an amendment if it seems to be dramatically differing from the timeline that you proposed. You're not locked into that without any recourse. And finally, big tip here is if it is in your budget, make sure it's in your timeline and vice versa. So if you include work in your timeline, we need to see how that's happening in your budget as well, if it's going to include funding. If it's in your budget, we need to see when you're planning to do it in your timeline. This is just a handy thing to have both of these documents working hand in hand. And now we get into the budget. Many reviewers go straight to the budget first thing. They find that, they can read the project overview, and that helps them figure out the application. But if they look at the budget, they quickly realize exactly what this project is for, because it's exactly what you're asking for money for. And so, like the timeline, it's going to show that you're ready to go and you've thought about all of the expenses involved in a project. And so more detail is better as a result. Show your specific line items, and to show those line items, you need to collect the costs and show that you have a basis for it. So ask for estimates, use figures from a recent or similar project. When we get into the budget spreadsheet on the next slide, you'll be able to see more about what this spreadsheet is going to look like. Remember that in-kind supports, this is volunteer hours, donated materials, donated time, it counts as match. And so you can put that in there. It has a dollar value that can help you reach that one-to-one match that you need. Staff time, if you're paying your staff, it counts as cash match, but you have to be able to document that staff time was spent on this project specifically. And so that can be something like timesheets. Your staff indicates the percentage of time that they spent over a certain period of time on the project. And currently, up to 10% of the grant funds can be used for indirect costs. This is rent, utilities, salaries, personnel costs, professional service fees. It's possible this percentage may go up in the future, but currently it is at 10%. And many applicants decide that it's simpler not to use this 10%. But if it's something that you're interested in doing, you can. And it's 10% of the total grant funds requested. And again, just echoing, if it's in your budget, make sure it's in your timeline. So the question reviewers are going to be asked when they're looking at your budget is, does the budget contain the necessary expenditures to complete the tasks outlined in the timeline? And so, sometimes they can fill in the blanks for you, and they understand what you mean or something, but really you need to spell out precisely what the necessary expenditures are that you have in your timeline so that they can connect those dots. Because so often they're reviewing so many applications, their brains at a certain point can no longer connect dots. And so you want to make it as explicit as possible. When you get into the application, there is a link to the project budget Excel spreadsheet. And so this is what your budget is where you're going to fill in your budget. You're going to include a description of the work item, and then you're going to say how much of the grant funds are going to be paying for this particular item, how much of your match is going to be paying for the particular item, and ultimately you're going to want it to match one-to-one once you get to the bottom of the spreadsheet. And then other project costs. So this is non-state funds that you are using that are over and above your grant funds and your match funds, because oftentimes, you're requesting, $80,000, $100,000, but your project is more than $200,000 or $160,000. This is like a $500,000 project that you're trying to complete or something like that. And so this is where you put those other project costs so we can see what else is involved in this work. And it's specifying non-state funds because they're doing the math to show how much non-state funds are being leveraged. It's helpful for the program to be able to show that. And so if you have other project costs that are state funds, you're not going to include that here, but you're going to include it in your budget further information, which we'll get to at a future slide. And then source of match is, if known, that's not required at the time of application, but you can say we're getting funding from a Delaplane Foundation grant, or we're getting our match funding from, some other foundation grant, and you can show where you're getting that money from, even if it's not something you've secured yet. Liz, go ahead.
Sure. Well, I just wanted to mention, sometimes people need a little more understanding of how to represent their match. So the first column, that pink column that says work item, is always going to be a description of an expense, even if it's provided by matching funds, a donation, or volunteer time. So, for example, you might have all of your copywriting needs taken care of by a volunteer, but that's going to appear as copywriting at a certain number of hours at a certain volunteer value in that pink column, work item description. And even if there's no direct grant funds going into it, if it's all your match, you're gonna show what the value of that time in this particular example is. What we don't want we don't want that pink column to say match. We want it to express the work or expense that you would otherwise be paying for with cash. Even if it's in kind, it's going to show up as part of your match. I don't know if I muddied the waters or not, but but I just wanted to explain that, because sometimes we have matching dollars listed separately, but without any connection to what is the work that the matching support is actually going towards. So I hope that helps.
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, that's really important. And that's something that comes up. And so, yeah, as Liz says, this column needs to just be work being done. And that can be work that's being done by volunteers. It can be work that's being donated in some way. But the place where you indicate whether it's your grant or your match, you put in the other two columns. And so this is, so this is work item. Thank you, Liz. And the other thing I'd like to mention about the budget is, if you are working on an application and you're working on the budget and the rest of your application is not finished yet, you can definitely send just the budget to your grant contact, to me or to Liz or to Rachel. In fact, often as we get closer and closer to the grant draft review deadline, we'll start reaching out to people and saying, even if you only have your budget, please just send the budget, because if that budget is messy, no matter how well written the rest of your application is, it's going to have a very hard time competing. Whereas if you have a budget that is correct, then then that's almost half the battle in many ways. Whereas a budget that is incorrect, it can make you ineligible. And so it's very important to have your budget be clear and correct. So later on in this budget category, there is space for some text and in the application itself. So additional budget information is where you can elaborate on how you determined these budgeted work items. And there's also space within this for attachments for supporting budget documents. And I really encourage you to upload any quotes or invoices or estimates you might have into supporting budget documents. We'll get into the specific tips later, but I would also add, if you're uploading your invoices and things like that, include an additional budget information, why you want to go with this particular vendor. Every now and then we'll come up with an application and a reviewer will ask, this seems expensive. Is this too much for this particular project? And we need to know, we need to find a way to assure them that, yes, this is the cost of doing this particular project correctly. And so if you're able to include that in your additional budget information, that can be helpful. And your supporting budget documents will show the basis of this cost. Maybe it'll show that, the amount of time that's going to be dedicated to this, the amount of detail that's going to be provided in this particular project justifies that expense. So just a tip for your budget information. All right, we're going to get into project impact. Liz, I'm going to take it to you.
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. So yes, project impact, as this slide tells you, is worth 80 points. So you do want to take some care with how you're expressing your project impact, and we'll just go through this side by side if you don't mind advancing it for us there, Emily. So the first question, and this really this is what we're about. How does this project result in increased heritage tourism? And this is valued at 23, up to 23 points. You do want to refer to the project grant guidelines, which provide a glossary and define how the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority perceives heritage tourism. And so that's given for you here on the slide. I do want to make a note that our heritage area is very well supported by our DMOs, otherwise known as our tourism directors in all three counties. And they look at heritage tourism through a slightly different different way of thinking. They are really focused on, are you putting heads in beds? Now that is not the only way the Heritage Areas Grant Program thinks about heritage tourism, but if you can make an argument for how your project is going to either directly or maybe indirectly, if it's a preservation project that isn't necessarily immediately producing a visitor experience, but one way or the other, it's going to lead to more people being drawn to come to our area, or maybe deciding to stay a little bit longer, resulting in those overnight stays that our tourism organizations really want to see. As Emily has mentioned, there's a state level review and a local review. Our local reviewers are thinking about that. And at the state level, there's also some thinking along those lines. But it's not the only measure of tourism. The Heritage Areas program does look at this a little bit more broadly. And of course, we well recognize that our own local residents need to be engaging with our heritage and with the products that our program supports, because we need our residents to appreciate and enjoy these things, and to be ready to share that enjoyment with others that are coming to this area. So just let's move on to the next slide. So again, how is your project going to build partnerships in your heritage area? This is worth 15 points. I like to point out that your description of partnership should be specific. A weaker application is going to simply name a few other organizations that you are friendly with. You might work with Visit Frederick or Visit Hagerstown, but only name it in kind of a generic way. Or you might say, oh, this project is going to is going to be a part of a bigger heritage experience that might involve some other places, but you need to get down to specifics. Exactly how is, say, Visit, your tourism organization prepared to contribute to your specific project that you're seeking support for, and then ask them to provide letters that actually outline, you know, we're in support of this project, and here's what we hope to bring to the table. And that might be, it might be editing, it might be it it might be we're going to offer a page on our own website that helps promote. I mean, you know, that this can be any range of ways that you're partnering with other organizations, but try to be specific. It will impress reviewers more if they can see this isn't just a passive thing, but this is an active way that you have partners collaborating with you to bring your project to fruition. Okay, next slide, please. So how will this project sustain regional identity or showcase your heritage area's distinctive cultural, historical, and natural assets worth 20 points? For this, you're going to really have to have done your homework. On our website, and I know Emily can point you to these things directly, there are two different documents that you want to become familiar with. The Heritage Area Management Plan. This management plan has been in place for a long time, but there's still a lot about it that is foundational and continues to be relevant. There are some bits of the management plan that we've achieved, and but it does describe our values, our priorities, the things that we think that are important to sustaining and growing the heritage area as a tourism asset. So understand how your project fits with the management plan and be prepared to name these things. The other thing that you want to get familiar with is our current strategic plan. And this, so this is it's a 6-year plan. We're now in year 3 of that plan. And it addresses a little bit more where our real current focus is. In both the management plan and the strategic plan, you can find our themes that we're concerned with, and then some of our what we call foundational priorities for interpretation. And the more that you're specifically tying your project to what exists in these plans, the more of those 20 points you're going to earn. Okay, next slide. And then does your project highlight an aspect of Maryland's involvement in America's 250th anniversary? This is where you may gain a couple of extra points. And I wouldn't fret if you don't necessarily see an easy way or a clean way to make your case for this. But it may not be that hard. The US 250th anniversary is about the full 250 years of history, and even bigger than that. You know, if you have a project that may touch on, say, you know, pre-revolutionary years, indigenous stories, there still may be a way to make a fit. So don't fret if you're not a Revolutionary War site. But figure out a way to connect your project to the efforts that are happening locally. There are groups in all 3 of our counties that are working on making plans for the 250th anniversary. The statewide efforts, we have links to Maryland 250 that we can provide. And we also have links to the American Association for State and Local History field guides that can help you with identifying themes within, you know, what the larger nation, state, and local communities are considering valid. The 250th anniversary is a really hyper local event. So so think about that and make your case if you can. Don't worry about it if that doesn't seem possible for you. pardon me. So we also ask that your project address, excuse me. Emily, can you take this one while I clear my throat here?
Absolutely. And so this asks, how does your project address diverse or inclusive historical narratives? And so I really want you to think deeply and broadly about this question, because I think it's very possible that some part of your project could speak to that. And so address this thoroughly. What narratives are connected to your project? Think about who is telling the story at your site and the various stories that are available at your site. If you need help approaching this question, ask your local grant contact. But we can help brainstorm, and I think it will ultimately only make the project itself stronger. If you fully consider this question, what diverse or inclusive historical narratives can be connected to your project and how you're going to go about addressing them. I will say uh, if you approach this in a shallow way, it's really clear to reviewers, and it won't help serve your application or your points for this question. And so, yeah, however, every now and then, there's a project that's like, we just need a new roof. And I think you can say that, there's not an interpretive aspect to this project, but the building itself, allows us to tell the stories of, the people who lived in this house, including, stories of immigrants and enslaved people. And, here's how it connects to the diverse and inclusive historical narratives that make up the story of our community. And so, yes, that would be my guidance. Liz, is there anything that you have to add about this?
And so I would say that for this question, and really for all of these impact questions, remember that the grant reviewers, even locally, may not know your specific site or the specific, structure or story that you're trying to tell. Even within our heritage area, our local reviewers come from across 3 very large counties. They may not know you. And when it goes on to the state level, you really may have folks that have never even been to this part of Maryland. So remember that as you write your grants, especially I think for this question, reviewers that don't already know you may also be asking, well, who's telling these diverse and inclusive stories? How are they inviting the community whose story it is to be a part of how these things are told? So I encourage you, I literally hear that come up. We are allowed to listen to the state review happen. At that point, we local folks don't get to say anything, but I hear that asked when this particular criterion is being debated. And then, and just to reiterate the point that Emily said, even if you're doing something like putting a roof on a building, and it doesn't seem to be all that relevant to diverse and inclusive historical narratives, find a way to answer the question, even if it's, now setting up the structure so that future storytelling related to it can happen. And here's how this is going to come in. You really do not want to leave this question unanswered, but if necessary, you might have to take a indirect approach to it. I think that's it. So what provisions exist or will be made for physical or programmatic access by individuals with disabilities? So again, you should be able to make a connection here. I think we can brainstorm with you on how that happens. If you're in a situation where physical access in a historic structure is going to be limited, there's still ways that you should be able to answer this question. This, again, it's gonna earn you 5 points, and just your recognition that this is important will gain you some sympathy. So, and why does the project need to proceed at this time? This is 10 points. A lot of times these are really important 10 points, especially in a competitive year, and they're always competitive years now. Urgency can sometimes make the difference. Urgency might be you have a project, you have an important structure or an important, piece of land or waterway that is literally going to be lost in some measure if you can't proceed with your project. But urgency can also relate to upcoming anniversaries, some sort of, anything that's got a time limit that if you're not able to get going now, you're going to miss the opportunity. And that will also put your resources or your potential for leveraging or capitalizing on a market. All of this will make a difference. Urgency sometimes is very influential in these decisions. Okay. And I think this is back to you, Emily.
Sure, sounds good. So, so those were the criteria that are going to be applied to local review and also to the state review. Now, just local review, our local reviewers have one extra criteria, and this is just a few points that are available for particular types of projects. And so if you are able to point to a Civil War resource, which is named in our management plan, and check out these specific pages within the management plan, which is available on our website, or if it's not there, but you're able to make the case that the project is linked to a resource of significance to the Civil War, this will grant you extra points. And then if you answer yes to that, will the project also preserve a structure with Civil War significance or preserve or conserve land of Civil War significance? This is kind of a legacy project question. This is worth 1 additional point. And then if you cite stewardship as a primary goal of the project and explain how preservation or conservation will be achieved, since stewardship is one of our goals under our management plan, you will get another extra points. And so this adds up to 5 points total. Now, I think these are for Civil War resources. However, of course, history did not begin or end in the 1860s. And so if you have a site that predates the Civil War, perhaps, and maybe it's more connected to something like the French and Indian War, but it does have Civil War history, that's eligible, that'll count. If your site, say it was a post-war GAR meeting place or something like that, then you can also make the case that it is linked to the Civil War. Say your resource is a cemetery where there are veterans of the United States Colored Troops buried there, even if it was established in the 19 teens. I think you could certainly make an argument that it is an eligible resource in that way. And so there are a lot of, so this is just for locations, and this isn't supposed to be an extremely restrictive criteria, but it is specific. And so if you're able to make this argument that it is linked to a resource of significance to the Civil War in that broad interpretation, and it's preserving a structure or land of Civil War significance, this is, for legacy projects, and you cite stewardship to show you read our management plan, then you can get up to 5 extra points. Your local grant reviewers will be reading your application draft for this as well, but it's important that you know this. So that's just the final bit of special criteria for heritage area, part of the Civil War heritage area based applicants. All right, some final tips and next steps. All right, tips for writing grant applications. Liz brought this up earlier. Assume reviewers have no prior knowledge of your organization, of your site, of your project. And as Liz brought up, even if your region or your county or your town, don't assume that anyone knows anything about, the rich history of, all of these Polish immigrants in your railroad town. Don't assume anybody knows anything about that. You definitely tell us about it. Don't get distracted. Don't, tell us about it at the expense of clearly explaining your project, but provide us that context so that reviewers are aware. And to speak to that as well, solicit feedback on your application draft from someone who is unfamiliar with your project. Ensure that they're able to read it and understand what you're asking for, and they understand your site and they understand how your project is going to work. That's really helpful. And so along with your local project grant contact, get somebody else to read it for you. Double check the consistency of all elements. And so as we mentioned, make sure your timeline and your budget both align, and then make sure your project description is speaking directly to those particular deliverables. If there is a discrepancy, it will be very confusing, and we don't want reviewers to be confused about exactly what you are requesting. If your project is going to involve maintenance, and it probably will, whether that's ongoing hosting of a website or upkeep of a wayside or the future of an exhibit, non-capital and capital projects are going to require maintenance. Describe your plan to maintain it, especially if your application says, we haven't updated something in decades, or this building is in, incredible disrepair at this point. Explain to us how this isn't going to happen again in the next 50 years. Even if it's not your fault as an organization and, you just got this resource or something like that, explain to us the plan for the future. And also think strategically about your phases. A lot of multi-year phase projects can experience great success with this grant program. And so if you have a multi-part project, consider breaking it into multiple multi-year phases. And if you plan to do that, make sure that your phases are very clear, so that it's clear what's a past phase and what your current phase is asking for. And then, briefly add the context of the overall vision with the final phase, but make sure it's clear. I'm going to mention that again on this slide with observations from last year. Liz, you haven't seen this slide before, so I'm going to ask for your feedback as well. I will say projects that made a strong connection to the Civil War time period generally performed better than projects that didn't last year. So you are not required to have a Civil War based project. It doesn't have to be the 1860s. It doesn't have to be military history, but you have to be able to make the argument for how you're adding to sort of the interpretive ecosystem that we have in the region around, antebellum, Civil War, Reconstruction period. If you're able to do that, projects generally perform better. Projects with clear heritage tourism value. You need to think about how you can attract and serve visitors with this specific product, this specific project. If you have say a conservation project, that's something that visitors won't necessarily be able to see right away. That's not a project that's asking to display something. It's a project that's asking to conserve something so that it can be displayed in the future. So we need to know what the plan is for the display. How is this going to become a heritage tourism product? Do you have a plan for that next step? That is important to perform well. Projects that are immediately ready to begin generally do pretty well. Reviewers notice when all the ducks are in a row and they just, the work is just waiting for you to press that button and say begin. Those do pretty well. Applicants perform better when they clearly communicated who is working on the project and their credentials. This was something that came up many times last year, where there were questions from reviewers about who is performing this work. What are their credentials? How do we know that they're qualified to do this work? Oftentimes, your local grant reviewer, if you worked with them, we're able to fill in some of those blanks about who they're working with, how that choice was made, because we've spoken with you before. However, if you write it in your application, then you won't even get that question. Reviewers will immediately understand that you have qualified contractors, qualified staff to work on this particular project, and it's clear that you've lined up a team to successfully execute this project. Multi-phase projects. Multi-phase projects are great. However, they can get confusing. And so you must be clear about your current phase in your project overview, your project description, your timeline, your budget, make super clear what your current phase is versus your past and your future phases. The context of the past and future phases are generally important for multi-phase projects. However, if you create any confusion around what this particular grant application is for, that can sometimes scuttle, a worthy project because reviewers don't fully understand what the project is. And so your local grant contact is going to try to be as helpful as possible with ensuring that this is clear. But as you're writing, definitely keep this at front of mind that it can quickly get confusing to folks who are reading a bunch of applications who are not familiar with your project. Include invoices and ideally, in many cases, some justification for your selection of vendors. Check the MHAA guidelines on this. Once you get above a certain threshold, you may have to do a whole bidding out process. But when it comes to the justification for your budget, that can be helpful. Because sometimes there are questions about, is this too cheap? Is this too expensive? If you're able to include, the person who's going to do the brick repointing is, a trained historic preservation mason, and they're going to use the correct mortar for this project because we are aware that there are issues with using modern mortars on historic bricks, things like that. You want to make sure that you've anticipated any questions or objections. And then finally, including relevant pictures is so helpful. Every now and then we'll get a facade project or something like that, or any project that is describing an issue or describing a location, and there are no pictures to help our reviewers. And they look it up on Google Maps and they're doing some extra research to try to figure out what this project is talking about. And so if you can include pictures with your application, you'll fill in that blank for them right away and they'll immediately understand what you're talking about. Now, definitely make sure that all of your attachments are relevant to the project. We don't necessarily need to see, like your board meeting minutes. We don't need to see a ton of extra information. We don't need a 150-page packet. But, if you are discussing something in your application that would be better illustrated with a picture, or that would be, well supported by an invoice, definitely please do include those things. So Liz, do you have anything to add to that? This is, these are just some observations from last year's review that I thought it was important people are aware about.
I would just say on the question of estimates, they don't necessarily have to be formal estimates. They may be, but maybe you've got a ballpark, or maybe you're going to cite a recent comparable project, but it includes something that helps the reviewer understand that the numbers you're putting in your budget are realistic. You can get the formal estimates later, or you can get them now. And as Emily said, in some cases, you will be required to do a competitive bid process. And so some of that is going to happen after the case. But whatever you can do to help assure the reviewers that that you're working with reasonable numbers is helpful. It's the main thing I thought I'd mention.
Thank you. All right, so practical next steps. What should your list look like now? Fill out an intent to apply by January 27th. Just fill it out. You can, include as much or as little detail in that ITA as you wish. You are not going to be scored based on the ITA. It just lets us know that there is the possibility of a project grant application coming in from this organization within this heritage area. And it starts the process for us to reach out to you as well, because we try to reach out to everybody who submits an ITA as their local grant contact to learn more about the project and to provide support for the application process. And then also, you're going to look at the resources on our Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area project grant page. We have guidelines. We have, we have a lot of links there that are going to be relevant for local applicants. Get in touch with your local grant contact. If you're able to get in touch with us before we reach out to you, even better. So we want to get talking as early as possible. We can help with gearing your project to make it as competitive as possible. And then work on preparing your application. The deadline for review is February 14th. Now, that deadline is the deadline by which we are going to be able to offer really substantive feedback, and you will have time to make changes ahead of the submission deadline on March 3rd. If you get us something after February 14th, or especially if we have kind of a developing conversation happening throughout the month and you're getting us pieces of it throughout the month, we are going to work really hard to get to that and provide you the feedback you need. But February 14th is kind of the deadline for allowing enough time for us to get through the applications we've received, the drafts, and for you to have time to make the necessary changes. And then the due date for submission is March 3rd, and then you're done. So, all right, so accessing the intent to apply, you are going to go to the Maryland Heritage Areas page on the MHT website, and the intent to apply link is going to be in a bar on the far right. Many of you probably already have accounts in this grant software, but I've heard it's a fairly simple process to create an account. And then to navigate to our website to see project grant information, go to heartofthecivilwar.org, scroll down to the bottom. And at the bottom, you'll see these resources for stakeholders and click on MHAA project grants. Once you get to that, you will see we have dates and deadlines listed out. We have the virtual Q&A sessions that are going to be hosted by MHAA and their staff. We have some upcoming. We're going to have a recording of this as well. This is a larger page that I've taken a screenshot from. Just a reminder, this is us. So Liz, who spoke earlier, is the Frederick County Grant Contact. She is the Executive Director of the Heritage Area. Rachel Nichols is here for Washington County applicants. I'm here for Carroll County applicants. But if you reach out to any one of us, we can pass you to the correct grant contact. And then Olivia Peterson is going to be sending follow-up from this presentation, and she's also a very useful resource. So feel free to reach out to her too. If you have any questions, she can ask one of us in our offices. All right, so we have made it through the information of the information session. So thank you for joining us for this part. I am going to go ahead and stop recording.